History did not lie quietly. It hired a marketing team. Watch till the end because the myths get dumber, louder, and somehow more believable. 1. Napoleon was extremely short. Everyone loves picturing Napoleon as a tiny, angry man stomping around Europe like a furious substitute teacher with artillery. The truth is much less cartoonish. Napoleon was about 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7 in modern measurements, which was actually around average, even slightly above average, for a Frenchman of his time. The short Napoleon image was helped along by British propaganda, especially cartoons that painted him as a ridiculous little tyrant throwing tantrums across the continent. Add confusion between French and English measurements, plus his nickname Little Corporal, and suddenly history had a meme before memes existed. He may have had enormous ambition, questionable judgment, and a talent for turning Europe into a group project nobody asked for, but he was not some pocket-sized villain. The real myth is that height caused his ego. No, that disaster was completely factory installed. 2. Vikings wore horned helmets. If you imagine Vikings charging into battle with giant horns on their helmets, congratulations. You've been fooled by opera costumes and souvenir shops. Real Viking helmets were practical, simple, and designed to keep your skull attached to your body, not make you look like the mascot for an angry Scandinavian steakhouse. Archaeologists have found very little Viking helmet evidence, and the famous Geirmundbu helmet from Norway has no horns at all. Horns in actual battle would be a terrible idea. One good swing from an enemy and your dramatic headgear becomes a convenient handle for removing you from history. The horned Viking look became popular much later, especially in 19th century art and opera, because apparently regular helmets weren't theatrical enough. So no, Viking warriors were not running around like heavy metal goats. They were terrifying enough without turning their heads into furniture. 3. Columbus proved the Earth was round. This myth is so stubborn, it deserves its own monument made of wrong textbooks. Columbus did not sail west to prove Earth was round. Educated Europeans already knew that centuries before he was born. Ancient Greek thinkers had argued for a spherical Earth long before 1492, and medieval scholars were not all sitting around terrified of falling off the edge like nervous cats on a kitchen counter. The real debate was not Earth's shape, it was distance. Columbus badly underestimated how far Asia was from Europe by sailing west, which is why his plan looked risky to people who could actually do math. He didn't discover a round planet. He accidentally ran into the Americas while looking for Asia and then spent years being impressively confused about it. So the famous brave genius versus flat earth idiots story is mostly historical fan fiction. Columbus wasn't proving Earth was round. He was proving that being confidently wrong can still get you famous. 4 people in the Middle Ages believed the Earth was flat. This is one of history's most successful myths, mostly because it makes people from the past seem less intelligent than they really were. In reality, educated Europeans throughout the Middle Ages knew perfectly well that the Earth was round. They inherited this knowledge from ancient Greek scholars like Aristotle and Eratosthenes, who even estimated the Earth's circumference with surprising accuracy. Medieval universities taught the spherical Earth as accepted science, and sailors navigated accordingly. The idea that everyone believed in a flat Earth became popular much later, especially during the 19th century, when some writers wanted to create a dramatic story about science defeating ignorance. It made for a better narrative than admitting people had already figured it out centuries earlier. Christopher Columbus never stood alone against terrified officials who thought his ships would fall into space. The real argument concerned whether his calculations of Earth's size were correct. Ironically, Columbus underestimated the distance to Asia, while his critics were much closer to the truth. Sometimes history doesn't need villains. It simply gets rewritten because a better story sells more books. 5. Marie Antoinette Said, "Let them eat cake." Few quotes have damaged someone's reputation more effectively than this one. According to the popular story, when Queen Marie Antoinette learned that French peasants had no bread, she casually replied, "Let them eat cake." It perfectly fits the image of a spoiled queen completely disconnected from ordinary life. The only problem is that there is no reliable evidence she ever said it. Versions of the quote existed decades before she even became Queen of France. Philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau mentioned a similar story in his writings while Marie Antoinette was still a child living in Austria. During the French Revolution, revolutionaries needed symbols of royal excess, and attaching this line to the unpopular queen was politically useful. It spread quickly because people already wanted to believe the worst about her. While Marie Antoinette certainly enjoyed luxury and court life, historians have found no contemporary source proving she uttered those famous words. The sentence survived because it was memorable, not because it was true. History occasionally works like gossip in a small town. The most entertaining version usually wins. 6. The Great Wall of China can be seen from space. This claim has appeared in classrooms, travel brochures, and family conversations for generations. It sounds impressive. Build something enormous enough, and surely astronauts can spot it from orbit. In reality, it is much more complicated. From low Earth orbit, where astronauts aboard the International Space Station travel, the Great Wall is extremely difficult to see with the naked eye. Its color blends into the surrounding landscape, and much of it is relatively narrow. Astronauts themselves have repeatedly confirmed that they generally cannot identify it without special lighting, optical aids, or knowing exactly where to look. From the moon, the claim becomes even more impossible. The wall is simply far too small compared to the enormous distance involved. Plenty of modern structures, highways, airports, and even large cities are actually easier to notice under the right conditions. The myth survived because people love the idea of humanity building something so extraordinary that it becomes visible from outer space. The truth is still impressive. The Great Wall remains one of history's greatest engineering achievements without needing imaginary advertising from the moon. 7. George Washington had wooden teeth. America's first president has been linked with wooden dentures for so long that many people never question the story. It certainly creates a memorable image of Washington delivering speeches while chewing on a polished block of oak. The reality is much stranger. Washington suffered terrible dental problems throughout his adult life and lost most of his natural teeth long before becoming president. However, his dentures were not made from wood. Surviving examples show they were crafted from a mixture of materials, including ivory from hippopotamuses and elephants, human teeth purchased from donors, animal teeth, gold, lead, and metal springs. They were uncomfortable, difficult to wear, and often caused him considerable pain. Over time, the ivory became stained from food and drink, giving it a brownish appearance that may have looked like aged wood to later observers. That misunderstanding gradually transformed into the famous myth. If anything, the real story is even more unsettling. Imagine becoming president while wearing a collection of borrowed teeth held together by metal hardware. Suddenly, wooden dentures sound like the less disturbing version. 8 witches were burned during the Salem Witch Trials. Hollywood loves dramatic bonfires, terrified crowds, and innocent women surrounded by flames. It creates unforgettable scenes, but it is not what happened in Salem. During the infamous Salem Witch Trials of 1692 in colonial Massachusetts, 19 people were executed after being convicted of witchcraft. None of them were burned alive. Instead, they were hanged. One additional victim, Giles Corey, refused to enter a plea and was pressed to death beneath heavy stones, making his execution one of the most horrifying in American history. Burning accused witches was practiced in parts of Europe under certain legal systems, which probably explains why many people assume Salem followed the same method. The actual tragedy was no less shocking. Fear, superstition, personal grudges, and weak evidence combined to destroy innocent lives in a community consumed by panic. The Salem trials have become a warning about mass hysteria and the dangers of abandoning reason. The real events are tragic enough without borrowing dramatic details from entirely different countries and different legal traditions. 9. Albert Einstein failed math in school. This myth appears every time someone wants to encourage struggling students. The message sounds comforting. If Einstein failed math, then anyone can become a genius. Unfortunately, the story falls apart under even a quick look at historical records. Einstein was actually an outstanding mathematics student from a young age. By the age of 12, he was teaching himself advanced geometry and algebra that many adults found challenging. School records from Switzerland show excellent marks in mathematics and physics. So where did the confusion begin? Part of it came from differences between grading systems. In one system, lower numbers represented higher achievement, while another used the opposite approach. People later misread those grades and assumed poor performance. Einstein himself repeatedly denied the rumor, joking that he had mastered calculus long before most students his age. His real struggles involved occasionally disagreeing with rigid teaching methods and authority figures, not understanding mathematics. It turns out that history sometimes prefers an inspiring fictional comeback story over the less dramatic truth that genuine brilliance often looks exactly like genuine brilliance. 10 medieval people thought tomatoes were poisonous. According to the popular version, Europeans avoided tomatoes for centuries because they believed the fruit was deadly. Like many historical myths, this one contains a tiny grain of truth wrapped inside a much larger misunderstanding. Tomatoes arrived in Europe from the Americas during the 16th century. Some wealthy Europeans became ill after eating them, but the tomatoes themselves were not the real culprit. Many upper-class families ate from expensive pewter plates containing high levels of lead. The natural acidity of tomatoes caused lead to leach into the food, resulting in lead poisoning. Since poorer people usually ate from wooden bowls and suffered no such effects, confusion spread among the wealthy. In addition, tomatoes belong to the nightshade family, which includes several genuinely poisonous plants, making some people naturally cautious. Despite these concerns, tomatoes gradually became common ingredients in countries like Italy and Spain, where cooks quickly recognized their value. The myth that everyone feared tomatoes exaggerates a limited concern into a universal belief. Once again, history proves that bad cookware can sometimes receive credit for mistakes it never actually made. 11. Nero did not play the fiddle while Rome burned. This image has survived for centuries because it is wonderfully dramatic. Rome is engulfed in flames, terrified citizens are fleeing through the streets, and Emperor Nero calmly stands above the chaos playing a violin. There is only one small problem. Violins did not even exist in the 1st century. The instrument we know today would not appear for more than 1,000 years. Ancient writers claimed Nero enjoyed performing music on an instrument called the lyre, but there is no reliable evidence he entertained himself while the Great Fire devastated Rome in AD 64. In fact, several historical sources suggest Nero was outside the city when the fire began and returned quickly to organize relief efforts. He opened public buildings to shelter survivors and arranged food supplies for those left homeless. That does not make Nero a hero. Ancient historians describe him as a cruel and unpredictable ruler responsible for numerous brutal acts. But the famous image of him casually providing a soundtrack to disaster is almost certainly political propaganda created after his death. Sometimes history cannot resist replacing complicated people with unforgettable scenes that never actually happened. 12. Medieval Europeans never bathed. Popular culture often portrays the Middle Ages as one endless cloud of mud, filth, and terrible smells. According to the stereotype, people avoided water completely and considered bathing dangerous or sinful. The truth is far more complicated. Throughout much of the medieval period, public bathhouses existed across Europe, especially in towns and cities. Wealthy households often had private bathing equipment, while monasteries included facilities for regular washing. Medical writers even recommended bathing for health, provided it was done in moderation. Things began to change after repeated outbreaks of disease and growing fears that public bathhouses encouraged immoral behavior or spread illness. By the 16th century, public bathing had declined in many regions, helping create the impression that Europeans had always avoided washing. In reality, medieval hygiene standards varied enormously depending on location, wealth, occupation, and historical period. People certainly did not shower every morning before work, but neither did they spend their entire lives proudly collecting layers of dirt. History often treats the Middle Ages like 1,000 identical years, when in fact, the period was constantly changing, just like every other chapter of human civilization. 13. The Iron Maiden was a common medieval torture device. Museums sometimes display terrifying iron coffins lined with spikes and confidently label them as medieval torture devices. Visitors leave convinced that prisoners regularly climbed into these horrifying machines. Historians, however, have uncovered a very different story. There is almost no credible evidence that the famous Iron Maiden was actually used during the Middle Ages. Most surviving examples were built centuries later, particularly during the 18th and 19th centuries when collectors loved creating sensational displays about medieval cruelty. Some devices were assembled from unrelated historical objects, while others were entirely manufactured to entertain tourists fascinated by gruesome history. Medieval Europe certainly employed brutal punishments, and torture did occur under specific legal systems, but the iconic spiked cabinet belongs more to Victorian imagination than medieval reality. It perfectly matched the era's fascination with dark castles, mysterious dungeons, and exaggerated tales of barbaric justice. The Iron Maiden became famous not because it represented ordinary medieval punishment, but because it looked terrifying enough to guarantee museum ticket sales. Sometimes even museums accidentally become storytellers instead of historians. 14. Pocahontas fell in love with John Smith. For generations, books and movies have transformed Pocahontas into the heroine of a romantic adventure. The familiar version tells of a young Native American woman who rescued Captain John Smith before falling deeply in love with him. While elements of their story are based on real events, the romance is almost certainly fictional. Pocahontas was probably around 10 or 11 years old when Smith first arrived in Virginia in 1607, making a romantic relationship highly unlikely. Smith himself did not describe the famous rescue until many years later, leading some historians to question whether it happened exactly as he claimed. It may have been a ceremonial adoption ritual that Smith misunderstood through the lens of his own culture. Years later, Pocahontas married English settler John Rolfe, and their marriage helped create a temporary period of peace between English colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy. She later traveled to England, where she became a symbol of successful colonial relations before dying at only about 21 years old. The real story is far more tragic and historically significant than the fairy tale romance that popular culture continues to repeat. 15. Pirates constantly buried treasure. Ask almost anyone to picture a pirate, and eventually someone will mention a treasure chest buried beneath a lonely palm tree with an X marking the spot. Surprisingly, this image owes far more to fiction than to actual piracy. Historical pirates usually stole goods that were easy to sell quickly, including food, cloth, spices, sugar, weapons, alcohol, and coins. Their lives were dangerous, unpredictable, and often very short. Hiding valuable loot underground made little sense when they needed money immediately for supplies, repairs, gambling, or drinking away their latest victory. The legendary Captain William Kidd is one of the few pirates actually known to have buried treasure, hoping to recover it later as evidence of his innocence. His unusual case helped inspire later adventure stories. Then novels like Treasure Island cemented the image forever. Buried treasure became one of literature's greatest inventions, even though most real pirates preferred spending stolen wealth as quickly as they acquired it. After all, if your profession carries a remarkably high chance of hanging from a gallows, saving for retirement is probably not your biggest concern. 16. The Trojan horse was definitely a giant wooden horse. Nearly everyone knows the dramatic ending of the Trojan War. Greek soldiers supposedly hid inside a massive wooden horse, which the Trojans proudly dragged into their city before discovering, far too late, that they had delivered their own destruction. The problem is that historians are not entirely sure this famous horse ever existed. The main source comes from epic poetry and later literary traditions rather than contemporary historical records. Some scholars believe the horse was symbolic rather than literal. It may have represented a siege engine, a battering ram, or even an earthquake, since the horse was associated with the god Poseidon, who was also linked to earthquakes. Others argue that some version of the story may preserve memories of a real military deception that became increasingly dramatic through centuries of storytelling. Archaeology confirms that Troy existed and experienced multiple wars, but the gigantic wooden horse remains uncertain. Whether it rolled through the city gates or simply galloped through the imagination of ancient poets, it remains one of history's most successful symbols of deception. 17. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. Cleopatra has become the ultimate symbol of ancient Egypt. She ruled from Alexandria, dressed in Egyptian royal style, and is forever associated with pyramids, pharaohs, and the Nile. Yet ethnically, she was not Egyptian at all. Cleopatra VII belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's Macedonian Greek generals after Alexander's death. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic rulers maintained Greek traditions and often married within their own family to preserve their dynasty. Cleopatra herself was likely of predominantly Greek ancestry. What made her remarkable was not her ethnicity, but her willingness to embrace Egyptian culture more fully than many of her predecessors. She learned the Egyptian language, something earlier Ptolemies rarely bothered to do, and presented herself as both a Greek monarch and an Egyptian pharaoh. This ability helped strengthen her political position during an incredibly unstable period. Hollywood often simplifies Cleopatra into a single cultural identity, but the real queen was a master of diplomacy, language, and political survival. Her greatest weapon was never her beauty alone. It was her extraordinary intelligence. 18 knights spent all their time rescuing princesses. Modern fairy tales have convinced generations that medieval knights rode endlessly from castle to castle rescuing princesses from dragons, evil wizards, or inconvenient towers. Real knights would probably have found that schedule surprisingly relaxing. In reality, most knights spent their lives training for combat, managing land, collecting taxes, enforcing local law, and participating in military campaigns. They were professional warriors first and romantic heroes second. The popular ideals of chivalry certainly encouraged bravery, loyalty, and honorable conduct, but those ideals were often more aspirational than practical. Medieval literature celebrated dramatic rescues because audiences loved exciting stories, much as modern audiences enjoy action movies today. Actual medieval warfare involved long sieges, exhausting marches, political alliances, disease, and logistical problems rather than dramatic sword fights on castle bridges. Many knights never encountered a princess at all. Instead, they worried about horses, armor maintenance, finances, and surviving their next campaign. Reality tends to replace heroic music with paperwork surprisingly often. Even in the Middle Ages, adulthood came with responsibilities that rarely made it into legendary ballads. 19. The Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4, 1776. Every 4th of July, Americans celebrate the signing of the Declaration of Independence as though the entire Continental Congress gathered around one document on a single glorious afternoon. The actual timeline was more gradual. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted to declare independence from Britain. 2 days later, on July 4th, delegates approved the final wording of the declaration. However, most members did not sign the famous parchment copy until August 2nd, and a few signatures were added even later. Contemporary newspapers quickly printed copies carrying the July 4th date, helping establish that day as the symbolic birthday of the new nation. John Adams himself believed July 2nd would become America's great national holiday because that was the day independence was officially approved. History had other plans. July 4th proved easier to remember because it appeared on the document itself. The celebration remains entirely appropriate, but the iconic image of every delegate dramatically signing together before heading home for fireworks belongs more to patriotic artwork than to the complicated administrative reality of revolutionary politics. 20 Vikings War. Skull helmets made from their enemies. Some of the wildest stories about Vikings describe fearless warriors drinking from human skulls and wearing armor decorated with the remains of defeated enemies. These gruesome images have filled novels, movies, and television for decades. Yet historians have found no convincing evidence that Vikings regularly used human skulls as drinking cups or crafted battle helmets from them. Much of this reputation grew from misunderstandings of medieval poetry, later legends, and hostile accounts written by people terrified of Viking raids. Norse warriors certainly had a fearsome reputation and could be exceptionally violent, especially during attacks on monasteries and coastal settlements. However, they were also skilled traders, explorers, farmers, shipbuilders, and settlers whose societies were far more complex than popular stereotypes suggest. Archaeological discoveries consistently reveal practical equipment rather than theatrical horror props. Real Viking helmets were built from iron, not human bones. Their longships changed European history. Their navigation skills reached North America centuries before Columbus, and their craftsmanship remains impressive today. The truth hardly needs embellishment. History's greatest explorers were already remarkable without turning every battlefield into the set of a horror movie. 21. The Spanish Inquisition expected everyone. Thanks to comedy sketches and pop culture, many people believe the Spanish Inquisition operated like a secret police force that could appear anywhere without warning. The famous joke that nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition has become so popular that it almost replaced the real history. In reality, the Inquisition was a formal institution with detailed legal procedures, written records, and official notices. If someone was accused of heresy, investigations usually took time, witnesses were questioned, and legal documents were prepared. That certainly does not mean the system was fair by modern standards. It could be harsh, politically motivated, and deeply frightening. However, it was not an unpredictable group of masked officials bursting through random doors without explanation. Many trials lasted months or even years. Ironically, the Inquisition produced enormous amounts of paperwork, making it one of the most thoroughly documented institutions of its era. The reality is less theatrical, but no less unsettling. Bureaucracy, it turns out, can sometimes be just as intimidating as dramatic surprise entrances, especially when the paperwork decides your future before you even enter the courtroom. 22 people thought the world would end in the year 1000. According to one of history's favorite stories, terrified Europeans spent New Year's Eve in the year 999 expecting the apocalypse to arrive by sunrise. Churches were supposedly overflowing, people abandoned their farms, and civilization waited for the final judgment. The evidence simply does not support this dramatic picture. Historians have found remarkably few contemporary sources describing widespread panic surrounding the arrival of the year 1000. One reason is surprisingly simple. Many people did not even use a calendar that emphasized counting years from the birth of Christ. Dates were often recorded according to the reign of kings, local rulers, or religious festivals. Daily survival mattered far more than celebrating the next millennium. Christian writers certainly discussed the end of the world as they had for centuries, but predictions appeared throughout history rather than concentrating on one specific date. The myth became popular much later because it perfectly matched the modern stereotype of medieval people living in constant fear and superstition. Once again, the real Middle Ages proved to be far more practical and less dramatic than later generations preferred to imagine. 23 Galileo was thrown into a dungeon for saying the Earth revolved around the sun. Schoolbooks often describe Galileo as a lonely scientific hero who spent years chained inside a dark prison simply for telling the truth about the solar system. His conflict with the Catholic Church was very real, but the details are frequently exaggerated. In 1633, Galileo was tried by the Roman Inquisition after publicly defending the heliocentric model, which placed the sun at the center of the solar system. He was found guilty of suspicion of heresy and forced to recant certain claims. However, he was not locked away in a medieval dungeon for the rest of his life. After a brief period in comfortable custody, he spent his remaining years under house arrest, first in the residence of a church official and later in his own villa near Florence. During that time, he continued writing scientific works, including important studies on motion and physics. His treatment reflected a complicated mixture of science, politics, religion, and personal rivalry. The true story remains a cautionary tale, but it is far more nuanced than the popular image of a scientist permanently imprisoned in chains. 24. Marie Antoinette invented high heels. Luxury fashion often gets blamed on French royalty, and Marie Antoinette receives credit for countless trends she never actually started. One persistent myth claims she invented high heels to appear taller and more elegant. In reality, elevated footwear had existed for centuries before she was born. High heels were originally worn by Persian horsemen, whose raised heels helped secure their feet in stirrups while riding. The style later spread into Europe during the 17th century, where aristocrats of both sexes embraced them as symbols of wealth and status. Even King Louis XIV famously wore elaborate red heels to emphasize his royal authority. By the time Marie Antoinette became Queen of France, high heels were already well established among European nobility. She certainly wore fashionable shoes and influenced trends in clothing and hairstyles, but she did not invent the heel itself. Fashion history often works like celebrity gossip today. Once someone becomes famous enough, almost every stylish invention eventually gets attached to their name, whether they deserve the credit or not. 25. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed in one catastrophic fire. One of history's greatest tragedies is usually told as a single dramatic moment. Flames rise into the night sky, priceless scrolls disappear forever, and the world's greatest library vanishes in one devastating disaster. The truth appears to be much slower and far more complicated. The Library of Alexandria almost certainly suffered damage on multiple occasions across several centuries. Julius Caesar's campaign in Egypt may have caused accidental fires that affected nearby warehouses containing books. Later, political conflicts, economic decline, changing rulers, and reduced financial support gradually weakened the institution. Additional destruction likely occurred during later periods of religious and political upheaval. Rather than one unforgettable night, historians believe the library slowly declined through repeated losses until it eventually disappeared. That gradual ending is less cinematic, but far more believable. Great institutions often collapse through neglect, changing priorities, and decades of instability rather than one spectacular catastrophe. It is a reminder that civilization's greatest achievements rarely disappear overnight. More often, they fade piece by piece until future generations suddenly realize how much has already been lost. 26 medieval castles were dark, cold, and miserable all the time. Movies love showing castles as gloomy stone prisons where everyone shivered beside tiny fires while rain leaked through every crack. Although castles could certainly be uncomfortable by modern standards, they were not designed to make their owners miserable. Wealthy nobles invested heavily in making their homes as comfortable as possible. Great halls contained enormous fireplaces capable of heating large spaces. Walls were often covered with colorful tapestries that added decoration while reducing drafts. Floors might be layered with rushes, carpets, or woven mats, while windows in important rooms sometimes contained expensive glass. Kitchens produced elaborate meals, musicians entertained guests, and noble families filled their residences with furniture, artwork, books, and luxury goods. Castles also evolved over centuries as military technology changed. Some were primarily defensive fortresses, while others became elegant palaces designed more for comfort than warfare. Life inside certainly lacked central heating and modern plumbing, but it was far removed from the permanently freezing stone caves often shown on screen. Medieval aristocrats appreciated comfort every bit as much as wealthy homeowners do today. 27 ancient Romans spent every meal vomiting so they could keep eating. This myth has survived because it is simultaneously shocking, disgusting, and memorable. According to the popular version, wealthy Romans routinely visited special rooms called vomitoriums, where they deliberately emptied their stomachs between courses during enormous feasts. In reality, the famous vomitorium had absolutely nothing to do with vomiting. The word referred to the large passageways in Roman theaters and stadiums through which crowds quickly entered and exited the building. The name came from the Latin verb meaning to spew forth, describing people flowing out into the streets rather than food coming back up. Ancient Romans certainly enjoyed extravagant banquets, especially among the elite, and some individuals were criticized by contemporary writers for excessive eating and drinking. There are isolated accounts of deliberate vomiting, but it was far from an ordinary social custom. The image of every Roman dinner party, including scheduled trips to the vomitorium, is entirely fictional. Once again, an unfortunate misunderstanding of one Latin word created a historical myth far more famous than the actual architecture ever became. 28 Marco Polo introduced pasta to Italy from China. It sounds like the perfect travel story. An adventurous explorer discovers noodles in China, carries them back to Italy, and accidentally changes world cuisine forever. Unfortunately, history refuses to cooperate. Pasta existed in Italy long before Marco Polo returned from Asia in the late 13th century. Historical records describe various forms of pasta being made and eaten across the Italian peninsula centuries earlier. Arab influence in Sicily helped introduce dried pasta production, while Roman writers mentioned foods resembling pasta long before Marco Polo was even born. Chinese noodles and Italian pasta developed independently using different ingredients, techniques, and culinary traditions. Marco Polo certainly encountered fascinating foods during his travels, but there is no evidence he introduced pasta to Europe. The myth became popular because it neatly connected two famous cultural traditions through one well-known explorer. Reality is less convenient. Great ideas often emerge in different places at different times without requiring a single heroic messenger to carry them across continents. Sometimes civilizations simply arrive at similar solutions using their own ingredients and imagination. 29 medieval doctors believed disease was caused only by evil spirits. The Middle Ages are often portrayed as an age when medicine consisted entirely of prayers, magic, and superstition. While religious beliefs certainly influenced healthcare, medieval physicians actually inherited a sophisticated body of medical knowledge from ancient Greek and Roman scholars. Doctors studied texts by Hippocrates and Galen, examining theories about anatomy, diet, environment, and the balance of bodily humors. Universities across Europe established medical schools where students received formal education. Treatments frequently included herbal remedies, surgery, bloodletting, dietary advice, and observation of symptoms. Many approaches were ineffective by modern standards, and some caused harm, but physicians did not simply blame every illness on demons or supernatural forces. During outbreaks like the Black Death, medical understanding struggled against diseases that no one yet understood, leading to a mixture of scientific observation, religious interpretation, and desperate experimentation. Medieval medicine represented a genuine attempt to explain the human body using the best knowledge available at the time. It was limited, certainly, but it was far more thoughtful than the simplistic caricature that history often remembers. 30. Isaac Newton discovered gravity because an apple hit him on the head. This story has become one of the most famous moments in scientific history. A lonely Isaac Newton sits beneath a tree, an apple falls directly onto his head, and suddenly the law of gravity appears fully formed inside his brilliant mind. It is wonderfully simple, which is exactly why it refuses to disappear. Newton himself never claimed an apple struck his head. According to accounts from people who knew him, including his friend William Stukeley, Newton described watching an apple fall from a tree while reflecting on why objects always move toward the ground, rather than sideways or upward. The falling apple may indeed have inspired his thinking, but it was only the beginning of years of mathematical work, observation, and careful reasoning. His greatest achievement was not noticing that apples fall. Everyone already knew that. His genius lay in realizing that the same force pulling an apple toward Earth also governs the motion of the moon and planets. The legend survives because sudden flashes of inspiration make better stories than decades of patient calculation. 31. Napoleon was French. This one surprises almost everyone because Napoleon is practically the definition of a French historical figure. He ruled France, commanded French armies, and reshaped much of Europe. Yet Napoleon Bonaparte was not actually born in what had long been considered France. He was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, only a few months after France officially acquired the island from the Republic of Genoa. Before that, Corsica had fought for its own independence, and many local families, including Napoleon's, identified more with Italian culture than French traditions. Napoleon's first language was a Corsican dialect closely related to Italian, and when he entered French military school as a boy, classmates often mocked his heavy accent. He spent years trying to fit into French society before eventually rising through the military during the French Revolution. Ironically, the man who became one of France's greatest national icons began his career as an outsider who struggled to sound French. History has a funny habit of turning immigrants, outsiders, and newcomers into symbols of national identity once they become successful enough. 32. The guillotine was invented to make executions more brutal. Few inventions carry a darker reputation than the guillotine. The very name brings to mind the French Revolution, cheering crowds, and endless executions. Many people assume it was designed to create the most horrifying deaths imaginable. The reality is almost the exact opposite. Before the guillotine, executions varied greatly depending on social status and the skill of the executioner. Nobles might receive a relatively quick beheading with a sword, while ordinary criminals often suffered far more painful methods. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin argued that every condemned person should receive the same quick and relatively humane execution regardless of class. Although he did not invent the machine himself, his support for standardized execution caused his name to become permanently attached to it. The guillotine's mechanical blade aimed to produce an instant death without unnecessary suffering. During the Reign of Terror, however, its efficiency transformed it into a terrifying political symbol. An invention intended to reduce cruelty ultimately became one of history's most recognizable images of mass execution. Good intentions can sometimes acquire reputations their creators never imagined. 33. Betsy Ross designed the first American flag. Nearly every American schoolchild has heard the story. George Washington visits Philadelphia, knocks on Betsy Ross's door, and asks the talented seamstress to create the first flag of the United States. It is a wonderfully patriotic tale filled with symbolism and craftsmanship. The problem is that historians have found almost no contemporary evidence supporting it. The story first appeared nearly 100 years after the American Revolution, when Betsy Ross's grandson shared family memories about her role in designing the flag. While Ross certainly made flags during her career and probably supplied banners to the Continental Forces, there is no surviving document proving she designed the original Stars and Stripes. Several historians believe Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a talented designer, played a much larger role in creating the first official American flag. Hopkinson even submitted a bill to Congress requesting payment for his design work. He never received the compensation, but the paperwork survived. The legend of Betsy Ross remains beloved because it offers a simple human story behind a national symbol, even if the historical evidence tells a far more complicated tale. 34. Medieval armor was so heavy knights needed cranes to stand up. Movies often show armored knights collapsing onto the ground like overturned refrigerators, completely helpless until several servants rescue them. According to the myth, a fully armored knight required a crane just to climb onto a horse. In reality, properly made plate armor was remarkably practical. A complete suit typically weighed between 45 and 60 pounds, with the weight distributed across the entire body rather than resting only on the shoulders. Modern soldiers frequently carry heavier loads on long marches. Surviving fighting manuals and modern demonstrations show trained people running, climbing ladders, rolling on the ground, mounting horses, and even performing gymnastic movements while wearing authentic armor. Knights trained for years to fight in this equipment, and armor makers constantly improved mobility without sacrificing protection. Could an exhausted knight fall and struggle to get back up after hours of combat? Certainly. But the popular image of armored warriors lying on their backs waving their arms like stranded turtles belongs to comedy rather than history. Medieval engineers understood that armor which prevented movement would be just as dangerous as wearing no armor at all. 35. The Wild West was full of constant gunfights. Hollywood has convinced generations that every dusty frontier town experienced dramatic shootouts before breakfast, lunchtime duels in the street, and one final showdown before sunset. The real American West was dangerous in many places, but it was not an endless action movie. Famous gunfights like the one at the OK Corral became legendary precisely because they were unusual. Many frontier towns actually enforced surprisingly strict gun control. Visitors entering places like Dodge City or Tombstone were often expected to surrender their weapons upon arrival. Local sheriffs understood that combining alcohol, gambling, and heavily armed visitors usually produced terrible results. Violence certainly existed, especially during cattle disputes, robberies, and conflicts over land. But daily life involved far more ranching, farming, business, and community building than cinematic duels. Newspapers eagerly reported sensational gunfights because shocking stories sold copies, much like dramatic headlines today attract online clicks. The myth of the constantly violent Wild West survived because excitement is easier to remember than ordinary life. History rarely resembles the movie trailer version of itself. 36. Julius Caesar was born by cesarean section. The similarity between the name Caesar and cesarean section makes this myth almost irresistible. Many people assume the famous Roman leader entered the world through the surgical procedure that later carried his name. Unfortunately, chronology refuses to cooperate. In Julius Caesar's time, cesarean operations were generally performed only when a mother had already died or was beyond saving during childbirth. Caesar's mother, Aurelia, survived his birth by many decades and remained an important influence throughout his early political career. Ancient sources even describe her active involvement in family affairs long after her son's rise to power. The exact origin of the term cesarean section remains uncertain. It may come from a Roman law requiring unborn children to be removed from deceased pregnant women before burial, or from later interpretations connecting the procedure with the Caesar family. Whatever the explanation, Julius Caesar himself almost certainly experienced an entirely ordinary birth. The myth survives because word associations are powerful. Once people notice a familiar name, the human brain eagerly builds a story, even when history politely insists that the connection never actually existed. 37. Medieval people rarely lived past 30. Statistics can sometimes create the most misleading myths of all. People often hear that average life expectancy during the Middle Ages was around 30 years and conclude that almost everyone died before reaching middle age. That is not what the numbers actually mean. Average life expectancy was dramatically lowered by extremely high infant and childhood mortality. Many children died before their 5th birthday because of disease, poor sanitation, or limited medical knowledge. Those tragic losses pulled the overall average far downward. However, once someone survived childhood and reached adulthood, living into their 50s, 60s, or even 70s was entirely possible. Historical records contain countless examples of elderly kings, monks, merchants, craftsmen, and farmers who remained active late in life. Life was certainly harder than it is today, and illness or injury posed much greater risks. But medieval societies included grandparents, respected elders, and long-lived scholars, just as modern societies do. The misunderstanding comes from confusing average life expectancy at birth with expected lifespan after surviving childhood. Statistics tell the truth, but only when we ask them the right question. 38. Ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. Using slave labor, for decades, countless books and movies repeated the image of endless lines of brutalized slaves constructing the pyramids under the whips of cruel overseers. Modern archaeology paints a very different picture. Excavations near the pyramids have uncovered organized workers' villages complete with bakeries, breweries, sleeping quarters, medical facilities, and carefully planned cemeteries. The workers received food, medical treatment, and proper burials, honors unlikely to be granted to disposable slave laborers. Most historians now believe the pyramids were built largely by skilled laborers and seasonal workers who were recruited from across Egypt, especially during the annual flooding of the Nile when farming temporarily paused. Building the pyramids was likely viewed as a prestigious national project connected to religion, royal authority, and community obligation. The labor was demanding and sometimes deadly, but the workforce consisted primarily of paid or obligated workers rather than vast armies of enslaved people. The myth became popular because it fit modern assumptions about enormous construction projects. The archaeological evidence tells a far more organized and surprisingly sophisticated story. 39. The Black Death killed. Exactly half of Europe's population, the Black Death remains one of history's greatest catastrophes, and its death toll was undeniably enormous. Yet one number appears so frequently that many people assume it is an established fact. Exactly half of Europe died. In reality, historians cannot calculate such a precise figure. Population records from the 14th century are incomplete, and the plague affected different regions in dramatically different ways. Some cities lost well over half their inhabitants, while certain rural areas experienced significantly lower mortality. Current research generally estimates that between 30 and 50% of Europe's population died during the first major outbreak between 1347 and 1351. Later waves of plague continued returning for centuries, adding even more devastation. The true scale of the disaster remains almost impossible to comprehend regardless of the exact percentage. Entire villages disappeared, labor shortages transformed economies, and social structures changed across the continent. The myth lies not in recognizing the plague's horror, but in pretending historians can reduce one of humanity's greatest tragedies to a single perfectly accurate number. 40. The American Revolution was won. Mainly because of the Minutemen. Popular history often celebrates the brave Minutemen who rushed from their farms at a moment's notice, standing against the British Empire with remarkable courage. Their contribution was real and deserves recognition, but they did not win the American Revolution by themselves. The war lasted 8 long years and depended upon a complex combination of military leadership, political determination, international diplomacy, and enormous foreign assistance. The Continental Army under George Washington became the backbone of the American war effort, surviving terrible winters, supply shortages, and repeated setbacks. Even more importantly, France entered the war in 1778, providing money, weapons, experienced soldiers, and a powerful navy. The French fleet played a decisive role during the Siege of Yorktown, trapping British forces and helping secure the final major victory. Spain and the Dutch Republic also contributed in different ways by stretching British resources across multiple fronts. The Minutemen sparked the revolution with extraordinary bravery, but independence resulted from years of perseverance and international alliances. Like most great historical victories, success belonged to far more people than the legend usually remembers. 41. The Pilgrims wore only black clothes with buckled hats. Ask someone to picture the Pilgrims, and chances are they will imagine people dressed head to toe in black with enormous silver buckles on their hats and shoes. It is one of the most recognizable images in American history, yet almost every detail is wrong. The Pilgrims actually wore clothing in many different colors, including brown, green, blue, russet, and even shades of red. Black dye was expensive and usually reserved for formal occasions rather than everyday work. Even more surprising, the famous buckled hats did not become fashionable until decades after the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth in 1620. Contemporary paintings and written descriptions show much simpler clothing suited to farming, building homes, and surviving harsh New England winters. The familiar Thanksgiving image was largely created by 19th century artists who wanted to give America's founders a distinctive visual style. Their paintings became so popular that fiction slowly replaced reality. The real Pilgrims already faced enough challenges without spending every day dressed like they were permanently attending a very serious costume party. 42 Vikings called their horned drinking cups skulls. Stories about Vikings often claim they proudly drank from the skulls of defeated enemies during enormous victory feasts. It certainly sounds dramatic enough for a movie trailer. However, historians have found no convincing archaeological evidence supporting this famous image. The misunderstanding appears to come from medieval poetry and translation errors. Some Old Norse verses describe warriors drinking from curved objects, but later writers misunderstood poetic metaphors and transformed them into literal human skulls. Archaeologists have uncovered countless Viking drinking vessels made from wood, glass, pottery, metal, and genuine animal horns, but not carefully crafted human skull goblets used as everyday tableware. Viking society certainly valued bravery, warfare, and heroic reputation. Yet it also placed enormous importance on craftsmanship, hospitality, and trade. Great feasts were central to Norse culture, but guests were generally served from practical drinking vessels rather than gruesome trophies. The myth survived because later generations loved making Vikings appear even more savage than they already seemed. Reality reminds us that fearless warriors still preferred cups that did not previously belong to someone's head. 43. Paul Revere rode alone to warn the colonists. American legend has transformed Paul Revere into a lone midnight hero racing through Massachusetts while every sleeping village waited for his warning. His ride was undoubtedly courageous, but it was never a solo mission. Before British troops marched toward Concord in April 1775, colonial leaders had organized an impressive network of riders prepared to spread warnings across the countryside. Paul Revere was only one of several messengers sent that night. William Dawes departed by a different route, and Samuel Prescott joined them later before successfully continuing the warning after British patrols captured Revere. In fact, Prescott reached Concord while Revere never completed the full journey. The alarm system relied not only on riders, but also on church bells, signal fires, local militia officers, and neighbors quickly informing one another. Longfellow's famous 19th century poem made Revere the star because every memorable story likes a single hero. The truth is even more inspiring. The American resistance succeeded because ordinary people cooperated through an organized communication network that spread news remarkably quickly without telephones, radios, or the internet. 44. The Founding Fathers created a perfect democracy from the beginning. Many people imagine the United States Constitution emerging as a flawless document that instantly established the democracy Americans know today. The reality is far more gradual. The Constitution represented an extraordinary achievement, but it also reflected the political compromises and limitations of the late 18th century. Only certain citizens could vote in many states, slavery remained legal, women could not participate in national elections, and senators were originally chosen by state legislatures rather than directly by voters. Over the following centuries, constitutional amendments and new laws expanded voting rights, abolished slavery, guaranteed equal protection under the law, and gradually strengthened democratic participation. The Founding Fathers themselves often disagreed intensely over how government should function, and many expected future generations to revise their work when necessary. They understood that no political system would remain perfect forever. Rather than creating a finished product, they built a framework capable of evolving over time. The American system became stronger not because it never changed, but because it allowed future generations to improve what earlier generations had begun. 45. Queen Victoria never smiled. Look through old photographs and formal portraits of Queen Victoria, and you may notice one striking detail. She almost never appears to smile. This has led many people to believe she was permanently stern, humorless, and incapable of enjoying life. In reality, the absence of smiling had far more to do with 19th century photography than with Victoria's personality. Early cameras required long exposure times, making broad smiles difficult to maintain without blurring the image. Formal portraits also followed artistic traditions that associated serious expressions with dignity, intelligence, and authority. A monarch laughing widely for an official portrait would have seemed strangely informal to many people of the era. Personal letters, diaries, and accounts from family members describe Victoria as affectionate, emotional, and capable of laughing freely with those she trusted. She adored her children, deeply loved Prince Albert, and possessed a surprisingly sharp sense of humor. Modern expectations about photography simply do not match Victorian customs. The Queen did smile. She just usually chose not to do it while sitting perfectly still for several minutes in front of an enormous camera. 46. Medieval castles always had secret escape tunnels. Adventure novels love hidden passages. Every castle supposedly contained mysterious tunnels, allowing kings, queens, and knights to disappear dramatically whenever enemies arrived at the gates. While a handful of castles genuinely possessed concealed exits or postern gates for emergencies, secret tunnels were far from universal. Constructing long underground passages required tremendous engineering skill, enormous expense, and constant maintenance to prevent collapse or flooding. Most medieval rulers preferred stronger walls, deeper moats, larger garrisons, and better food supplies instead of investing in elaborate escape routes that might never be used. Archaeologists have investigated countless local legends about hidden tunnels connecting castles with monasteries, villages, or distant forests. In many cases, no evidence has ever been found. Others turn out to be old drainage systems, storage cellars, or later additions mistakenly identified as medieval escape routes. The idea became popular because secret passages make excellent storytelling devices. Real castles depended much more on careful planning, strong defenses, and patient endurance than on dramatic last-minute escapes worthy of an adventure film. 47. Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey to become America's national bird. Every Thanksgiving, someone confidently announces that Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey instead of the bald eagle on the Great Seal of the United States. Like many famous historical stories, it contains a small piece of truth wrapped inside a much larger misunderstanding. Franklin did criticize the bald eagle in a private letter to his daughter, describing it as a bird with questionable character because it sometimes stole food from other birds. In the same playful letter, he praised the turkey as a more respectable native species. However, Franklin never officially proposed replacing the bald eagle as the national emblem. The design had already been approved, and he was not campaigning to overturn it. His comments were humorous observations made during a family correspondence rather than serious political recommendations. Nevertheless, the anecdote became irresistible because it perfectly captures Franklin's wit and unconventional personality. The bald eagle remained America's national symbol, while the turkey gained something almost as valuable. It became the most famous bird in American holiday dinners without ever needing official government approval. 48. The Boston Tea Party was a protest against high taxes. The Boston Tea Party is often described as a simple tax revolt, with angry colonists refusing to pay excessive British duties on tea. While taxation certainly played a role, the situation was far more complicated. Ironically, the Tea Act of 1773 actually made legally imported British tea cheaper than much of the smuggled tea already sold in the colonies. The real controversy centered on principle rather than price. Colonists objected to Parliament imposing taxes without colonial representation and feared accepting the Tea Act would quietly acknowledge Parliament's authority to tax them whenever it wished. Many merchants also opposed the special privileges granted to the British East India Company, which they believed threatened colonial businesses. By dumping tea into Boston Harbor, protesters challenged political power rather than simply complaining about expensive beverages. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," captured the deeper constitutional issue. The event became famous not because people desperately wanted cheaper tea, but because they believed governments should not exercise unlimited authority over citizens who lacked a meaningful voice in making the laws. 49. Leonardo da Vinci invented everything he sketched. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks contain flying machines, armored vehicles, bridges, diving equipment, and countless other astonishing ideas. Looking through his drawings, it is tempting to imagine that he personally invented nearly every modern technology centuries ahead of everyone else. Leonardo was unquestionably one of history's greatest creative minds, but many of his famous designs were theoretical explorations rather than working inventions. Some built upon ideas that already existed, while others were never actually constructed during his lifetime. Modern engineers studying his notebooks have discovered that certain concepts would have worked with modifications, while others contained practical flaws caused by the technological limitations of the 15th century. Leonardo excelled at observing nature, imagining possibilities, and recording brilliant concepts on paper, but he often moved from one project to another before completing detailed engineering solutions. His greatest gift was not producing finished machines in large numbers. It was asking remarkable questions that inspired generations of inventors who eventually turned imagination into reality. His notebooks remain extraordinary precisely because they reveal curiosity without limits. 50. Ancient people believed history always moved forward. Modern society often assumes people throughout history naturally believed humanity was constantly progressing toward a better future. Surprisingly, many ancient civilizations viewed time very differently. The ancient Greeks, Romans, Hindus, and numerous other cultures often imagined history moving in cycles rather than along a straight line of continuous improvement. Greek writers described earlier ages of humanity as nobler and more virtuous than their own. Roman authors frequently complained that society had declined from the greatness of previous generations. Similar ideas appeared across many civilizations, where golden ages were believed to exist in the distant past rather than the future. The modern belief in inevitable progress became much more influential during the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, when scientific discoveries and technological advances transformed everyday life at an unprecedented pace. Before that, many people expected history to repeat familiar patterns instead of steadily advancing. It is an ironic reminder that our own assumptions about progress are themselves historical products. Every generation believes its view of time is obvious, until history quietly reminds us that earlier civilizations imagined the future in completely different ways. 51. The Great Fire of London ended the plague overnight. It is tempting to believe history occasionally solves one disaster by accidentally creating another. According to a popular myth, the Great Fire of London in 1666 burned away the rats, destroyed the disease, and instantly ended the Great Plague. The timeline certainly makes the story sound convincing. The plague reached its worst point in 1665, and the fire swept through much of central London the following year. However, historians have found little evidence that the fire directly eliminated the disease. Most plague outbreaks had already begun to decline before the flames appeared. Even more importantly, the fire destroyed only part of London, while many poorer suburbs that suffered heavily from plague remained untouched. Modern researchers believe a combination of changing rat populations, flea behavior, improved quarantine measures, and natural disease cycles probably played much larger roles. The fire did encourage rebuilding with wider streets and better construction materials, which improved public health over time, but it did not act as one enormous medieval disinfectant. Sometimes history produces neat coincidences that our brains eagerly mistake for simple cause and effect. 52. The Magna Carta immediately gave everyone equal rights. The Magna Carta has earned legendary status as one of the world's greatest documents of freedom. Many people imagine that when King John sealed it in 1215, ordinary English men and women suddenly gained equal rights and modern democracy was born. The actual document was much narrower in scope. It emerged from a political dispute between the king and rebellious barons who wanted to limit royal power and protect their own privileges. Most of its 63 clauses dealt with feudal obligations, land ownership, taxes, inheritance, and legal procedures affecting nobles, church leaders, and wealthy landowners. Ordinary peasants gained relatively little direct benefit from the agreement. In fact, the Magna Carta was annulled within weeks by the Pope, leading to renewed civil war. Its true importance grew gradually over centuries as later generations reinterpreted its principles. Lawyers, judges, and political thinkers transformed selected clauses into broader ideas about the rule of law, due process, and limits on government authority. The document became historically significant not because it instantly created modern liberty, but because future generations kept finding new meaning inside it. 53. Salem executed. Hundreds of witches. The Salem Witch Trials remain one of America's darkest chapters, and their reputation has grown so enormous that many people assume hundreds of innocent people were executed. The reality is still tragic, but considerably smaller in scale. Between 1692 and 1693, more than 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft in colonial Massachusetts. 19 were convicted and hanged, while one man, Giles Corey, died after refusing to enter a plea and being crushed beneath heavy stones. Several others died in jail before their cases concluded. Every death was a terrible injustice, but the famous image of hundreds of executions belongs more to fiction than historical records. The panic spread rapidly because of fear, religious tensions, personal rivalries, and weak standards of evidence that allowed dreams, visions, and accusations to influence court proceedings. Once respected members of the community became suspects, nearly anyone could fall under suspicion. Salem's legacy serves as a warning about mass hysteria, not because of enormous numbers alone, but because ordinary people allowed fear to replace reason and justice. 54. Medieval kings had absolute power over everyone. Movies often portray medieval kings as men who could wake up, invent a new law before breakfast, imprison anyone by lunch, and declare war before dinner without asking anyone's permission. The reality was considerably more frustrating for the average monarch. Medieval rulers constantly negotiated with powerful nobles, church leaders, wealthy merchants, local councils, and regional assemblies. Many kings depended on their vassals to provide soldiers, taxes, and political support. Refusing to cooperate with influential nobles could quickly lead to rebellion or even civil war. In England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and many other kingdoms, royal authority varied enormously, depending on the ruler's personality, military success, and financial resources. Even famous kings often spent much of their reign bargaining instead of commanding. Documents, oaths, feudal obligations, and local customs frequently limited what a monarch could realistically accomplish. Absolute monarchy became more common centuries later during the early modern period, but projecting that system backward creates a misleading picture of medieval politics. Crowns looked powerful, yet they often rested on surprisingly unstable foundations. 55 ancient Olympic athletes competed only for glory. Modern athletes dream of sponsorships, endorsement deals, and enormous prize money, while many people imagine that competitors in the ancient Olympic Games participated purely for honor. Officially, winners at Olympia received only a simple olive wreath. That sounds wonderfully noble until you discover what happened after they returned home. Victorious athletes often received generous financial rewards from their cities, including cash prizes, free meals for life, tax exemptions, valuable gifts, public statues, and political influence. Successful competitors became celebrities whose achievements brought prestige to their communities. Wealthy patrons sponsored promising athletes, and some professionals traveled from competition to competition seeking rewards. Ancient writers occasionally complained that sport had become too commercial, proving that debates about money in athletics are far older than television contracts. Winning the Olympic crown certainly carried enormous symbolic value, but it also opened doors to wealth and lifelong privilege. Human nature has changed remarkably little. Whether in ancient Greece or the modern world, exceptional athletic success rarely remains unpaid for very long. 56 medieval maps showed people. Thought the ocean ended at the edge of the world, one of the most persistent myths claims medieval mapmakers literally drew the edge of the world and warned sailors not to venture beyond it. The truth is more interesting. Medieval scholars generally accepted that the Earth was spherical, and many maps were never intended for practical navigation in the first place. Instead, they served religious, educational, or symbolic purposes. Famous medieval world maps often placed Jerusalem at the center, arranged continents according to biblical tradition, and included fantastic creatures or distant kingdoms because they reflected cultural knowledge rather than precise geography. Sailors relied on different kinds of charts, especially portolan maps, which accurately recorded coastlines, harbors, and sailing directions around the Mediterranean and later the Atlantic. These practical maps reveal that experienced navigators understood perfectly well that the sea continued beyond the visible horizon. Decorative monsters occasionally appeared in unexplored waters, but they represented uncertainty rather than literal beliefs about the world's edge. Medieval cartographers knew far less than modern geographers, yet they were not drawing maps for people afraid of sailing off a giant cosmic cliff. 57. The Bastille was packed with hundreds of political prisoners. When angry Parisians stormed the Bastille on July 14, 1789, the event became one of the defining moments of the French Revolution. Popular imagination often pictures desperate crowds liberating hundreds of innocent political prisoners suffering in dark dungeons. The actual prison population tells a different story. On the day the Bastille fell, only 7 prisoners were inside. 4 had been convicted of forgery, 2 were mentally ill, and 1 was an aristocrat imprisoned at his family's request because of scandalous behavior. The fortress mattered far more as a symbol than as a functioning prison. For generations, it represented arbitrary royal authority because kings could imprison individuals through special warrants known as lettres de cachet without a normal trial. Destroying the Bastille therefore carried enormous political significance, even though relatively few inmates remained behind its walls. The revolutionaries were attacking an idea as much as a building. Sometimes history remembers the symbolism of an event far more vividly than the practical details that actually unfolded on the ground. 58 ancient Spartans threw weak babies off cliffs. Sparta's reputation for harsh discipline has inspired one of history's darkest myths. According to the popular version, every newborn Spartan was carefully inspected, and any child judged weak or imperfect was immediately thrown from a cliff. Ancient writer Plutarch described infants being examined by elders, but modern historians question how literally his account should be interpreted. Archaeological investigations at the site traditionally associated with these executions have uncovered very little evidence supporting the mass killing of newborns. Most human remains discovered there belonged to adults rather than infants. Like many ancient societies, Sparta probably practiced some form of exposure in extreme circumstances, especially involving severe disabilities. But there is no convincing evidence of systematic cliff executions on the dramatic scale often portrayed. Sparta certainly maintained an exceptionally demanding military culture, beginning with rigorous training for boys at an early age. However, later writers frequently exaggerated Spartan customs to emphasize either admiration or horror. The real society was already strict enough without requiring every legendary detail to be accepted as unquestionable fact. 59 medieval people never used forks. Looking at historical movies, you might conclude that everyone in the Middle Ages ate with their hands while ignoring forks entirely. Although forks were certainly less common than they are today, they were not unknown. Two-pronged table forks appeared in parts of the Byzantine Empire centuries before, becoming fashionable in Western Europe. Wealthy Italian families gradually adopted them during the late medieval period, especially among the upper classes. Their spread, however, was surprisingly slow. Some religious critics considered forks unnecessary luxuries, while others believed using fingers reflected proper humility and gratitude for food. Knives, spoons, bread trenchers, and clean hands remained the standard dining tools for most Europeans. As trade expanded during the Renaissance, forks gradually gained acceptance throughout the continent before eventually becoming ordinary household items. The myth probably survives because forks became universal relatively late compared with knives and spoons. Once again, history reminds us that everyday habits evolve gradually. Even something as ordinary as table manners follows a long and surprisingly complicated journey through the centuries. 60 history is mostly a collection of proven facts. Perhaps the biggest historical myth of all is the belief that every important event has already been completely explained. In reality, history is an ongoing investigation rather than a finished encyclopedia. Every year, archaeologists uncover forgotten cities, historians discover overlooked letters, scientists analyze ancient DNA, and researchers reinterpret familiar evidence using new technology. Questions once considered settled sometimes receive entirely new answers. Other mysteries remain unsolved despite centuries of study. Historians constantly compare sources, identify bias, challenge old assumptions, and debate competing interpretations. That does not mean history is simply opinion. Reliable evidence still matters enormously, but understanding the past requires accepting uncertainty where the evidence remains incomplete. Ironically, many of the myths in this video survived precisely because they offered neat, satisfying stories instead of complicated realities. The real past is rarely simple. It is full of contradictions, unexpected discoveries, and fascinating details that refuse to fit into convenient legends. That may be less comfortable than a perfect story, but it is also what makes history endlessly worth exploring. 61. The Roman Empire fell in a single day. History books often make it sound as if the Roman Empire simply stopped existing in AD 476, when the last Western Roman emperor was removed from power. It is a convenient date because people enjoy clear endings. The real collapse was anything but simple. The Western Roman Empire weakened gradually over centuries through political instability, civil wars, economic problems, invasions, shrinking tax revenue, and the enormous challenge of governing such a vast territory. Even after Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed, many Roman institutions continued functioning. Roman laws remained in use, roads were still traveled, cities survived, and people continued calling themselves Romans. Even more importantly, the Eastern Roman Empire, which modern historians often call the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly another 1,000 years until Constantinople fell in 1453. Its rulers never believed they were leading a different empire. They considered themselves Roman emperors. The famous Fall of Rome was therefore less like a building collapsing overnight and more like watching an old tree slowly lose branches over generations while another healthy trunk continued growing far to the east. 62. George Washington had perfect teeth in every portrait. Look at official portraits of George Washington, and you might assume America's first president possessed an impressive smile worthy of a toothpaste advertisement. Artists certainly did him a favor. Washington spent much of his adult life suffering from severe dental problems. By the time he became president, he had only one natural tooth remaining. His famous dentures were uncomfortable, often painful, and forced him to keep his mouth tightly closed during portraits. Painters deliberately softened the appearance of his swollen jaw and carefully avoided emphasizing the awkward shape created by his dentures. Washington himself was deeply self-conscious about his appearance, and surviving letters reveal his frustration with the constant discomfort. Modern forensic reconstructions suggest his face looked noticeably different from the idealized paintings that became national icons. The portraits were never intended as photographic realism. They were symbols of dignity, leadership, and stability for a new nation. Once again, history reminds us that public images have been carefully managed long before cameras, social media, or professional public relations teams ever existed. 63 Medieval Europe was cut off from the rest of the world. Popular imagination often treats medieval Europe as an isolated continent where people knew almost nothing about distant civilizations. In reality, long-distance trade and cultural exchange never completely disappeared after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Merchants carried silk, spices, precious metals, glass, ivory, and countless other goods across enormous distances. Italian trading cities maintained extensive commercial networks reaching the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Viking traders traveled through Eastern Europe to the Black Sea and the Middle East. Scholars translated scientific, medical, and mathematical works between Arabic, Greek, Latin, and other languages, preserving knowledge that later influenced the Renaissance. Travelers such as Marco Polo were unusual, but certainly not unique. Pilgrims, diplomats, merchants, missionaries, and sailors regularly crossed cultural boundaries despite the dangers involved. News traveled slowly by modern standards, but ideas still moved across continents with surprising persistence. Medieval Europe was never completely isolated. It was part of a vast web of trade routes and intellectual exchange that connected Africa, Asia, and Europe long before globalization became a modern buzzword. 64. The Renaissance began overnight. After the Middle Ages ended, textbooks often divide history into neat chapters, making it appear that Europe suddenly woke up one morning, declared the Middle Ages finished, and immediately began painting masterpieces while rediscovering science. Real history is much less dramatic. The Renaissance developed gradually over several centuries, beginning in parts of Italy during the 14th century before spreading across Europe. Many of the ideas associated with the Renaissance had deep medieval roots. Universities had already been expanding. Scholars had preserved and studied classical texts, Gothic architecture displayed extraordinary engineering skill, and advances in commerce, banking, and urban life were already transforming society. The Renaissance certainly produced remarkable achievements in art, literature, science, and humanist scholarship, but it built upon foundations laid by earlier generations rather than appearing from nowhere. Historians today increasingly emphasize continuity instead of sharp divisions between historical periods. The Middle Ages did not simply switch off so the Renaissance could switch on. Civilizations usually evolve through overlapping changes, where yesterday quietly becomes tomorrow without anyone noticing that history has supposedly entered a brand new chapter. 65. The American Civil War was fought only because of states' rights. This remains one of the most misunderstood topics in American history. Some people claim the Civil War was simply a constitutional disagreement over the balance of power between state governments and the federal government. While debates over states' rights certainly existed, the historical evidence overwhelmingly shows that the central issue behind secession was slavery. Several seceding states issued official declarations explaining why they were leaving the Union, and those documents repeatedly identified the preservation of slavery as their primary concern. Confederate leaders themselves openly described slavery as fundamental to their new nation. The dispute over states' rights largely centered on whether states could protect and expand slavery, while simultaneously demanding strong federal enforcement of laws requiring the return of escaped enslaved people. Like many historical conflicts, the Civil War involved economics, politics, constitutional questions, and regional identities. But those issues consistently revolved around the institution of slavery. Understanding this complexity does not simplify history. Instead, it respects the overwhelming documentary evidence left behind by the people who actually experienced the conflict and explained their own motivations at the time. 66 ancient people were less intelligent than we are today. Few historical myths are as flattering to modern society as the belief that people in the distant past were somehow intellectually inferior. Archaeology and neuroscience tell a very different story. Modern humans have possessed essentially the same brain structure for tens of thousands of years. Ancient engineers built monuments that still puzzle researchers. Greek mathematicians developed sophisticated geometry. Roman architects created durable concrete structures. Chinese inventors revolutionized technology. And countless civilizations solved incredibly complex problems using little more than observation, experimentation, and persistence. What has changed is not human intelligence, but accumulated knowledge. Every generation inherits discoveries made by previous ones, allowing new advances to build upon old foundations. A modern student can solve equations impossible for ancient scholars simply because centuries of scientific progress now appear in ordinary textbooks. If someone from the ancient world had access to today's education and technology, there is little reason to believe they would be intellectually outmatched. Human curiosity has remained remarkably consistent. The tools change. The brain using them is essentially the same remarkable instrument it has always been. 67 Columbus did not discover America. This may be one of the most familiar corrections in modern history, yet the older myth still refuses to disappear. Christopher Columbus reached islands in the Caribbean in 1492 while searching for a westward route to Asia. He never set foot on the mainland of what is now the continental United States, and he died believing he had reached regions connected to Asia rather than an entirely separate continent. More importantly, millions of indigenous people had already lived throughout the Americas for thousands of years, building sophisticated civilizations, cities, trade networks, and cultures long before European arrival. Nor was Columbus the first European to reach the Western Hemisphere. Around the year 1000, Norse explorers led by Leif Erikson established a short-lived settlement at Lonso Meadows in present-day Newfoundland, centuries before Columbus sailed. What Columbus truly accomplished was initiating sustained contact between Europe and the Americas, setting in motion exchanges of plants, animals, diseases, goods, and people that permanently transformed world history. His voyage changed the course of civilization, but it did not discover a land that was already home to millions. If this video busted a few lifelong beliefs, imagine how many more history still hides. Which myth shocked you the most, and which one did you believe for years? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more surprising stories that prove the truth is almost always stranger than the legend.